How many of you guys already use HTML5 aspects in any of your projects currently that you guys are aware of? Or it's usually a frivolous detail just because that's like saying, are we using Cold Fusion 10 compliant stuff or HTML5 compliant stuff? It's just another version upgrade. So HTML was introduced back in 1991, and that's been slowly progressing forward over time with different new features being added, such as CSS to separate out the presentation layer, JavaScript to create more of a interactive website. So HTML5 is a combination of just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Today we'll go over offline storage, communications, the file API a little bit, semantics, what changes have taken place there, a little bit of the graphics, a little bit of CSS3, and just a few little spare things. So for web storage, you can store things in key value pairs inside a local storage, inside a session storage. Everybody's pretty much familiar with how cookies work, where you just have your huge entire cookie string, and then that just gets passed along with every single request. And that normally has a max size of 3 megabytes, which is really kind of annoying if you have to transfer that every single request. Using session storage or local storage, you don't actually have to send it with every single request. It just lives inside of the browser based off of that URL domain. So if I actually go inside the developer tools, so then down here at the bottom I have my value that I just entered up to storage.
Yeah, this is actually something we're going to implement in the near future. It's useful because we have these paramedics in the fields who are going to be entering patients, and they might not have internet access. So this will allow us to temporarily store that so they can upload it later.
Can you store things other than strings in there?
You can store blobs, but most people, if they have to store, say like an object, they'll serialize it as JSON or deserialize it.
I'll use that for incident list. I wasn't sure if there was a better way of doing it.
Not for the local storage. And then for WebKit browser, they also have the WebSQL database, which is actually deprecated now. So I'll just go right over it. Which you can actually create a little SQL-like database that you can parse over if you want to put in a lot of information. The browser sets a size of initially by 5 megabytes, and then you can request it to be larger. And that's also based off of domain names, so if you have a few different domain names that you're managing, then you can also spread it out and hold different data.
Is it deprecated? Is there
a different one? Well, yes, there is. And it was replaced by IndexedDB, which is the same idea pretty much. It just has different functionality in a few places. Just a slightly different API. I think I had broken this actually last night. Yeah, I did. It's a similar API, and you can kind of go back and forth between the two of them. It has a lot of the same limitations as the SQL database as well, where you do have to ask for a larger size if you need to store things over 5 megabytes. But it is implemented in all of the modern browsers. IE 10 has it as well.
But not 9 and 8.
Not 9 or 8. Application cache is where you can specifically tell your website, the browser. You can say store a lot of files offline for offline usage when the user hasn't actually hit any of those files yet. So you're all used to the idea where you're visiting a website and then any images or CSS or JavaScript that you actually use during that page will get cached for offline for after use. Well, with this, you can actually say cache these other assets. The user hasn't used them yet, but they will most likely use them. So it's a little bit easier to create a full offline app.
Quick question.
Yep.
Will it notify the user that you're trying to store multiple files? Monitoring something like that?
It doesn't inform the user.
I just pulled up this slideshow on Firefox and the portal toolbar across the top asking if it can create local storage for offline use. I wonder if that would be a problem for a lot of users. Just
I'm trying to remember if that's from the application cache or from the local storage. It might be from this, I guess. Because then if they don't accept it, then it would just act like any other website where they would just have to request it, and then it would get cached at that point in time. So if I look at the application cache for this little website, the manifest just lists out a number of different assets that I have and has a particular version number. So if I change that, oh yeah, and then it will ask me if I want to load it. Then so real-time communications, WebSockets, SSE, which is server-sent events. And web workers. Most of us have the idea of where we might use threads in our applications to spawn off low requests where you send them and you typically kind of forget about them. Because once you start up a thread, you can't really have it talking back up to the master class. It's the same idea inside JavaScript, where you'll start up a new worker thread and you just have it keep going until it's done. So in this example, it's going to plot a bunch of lines in between different areas. If I do use the workers, the map won't be able to actually load. I think it will actually kill my browser. Yeah. Where if I find it with workers, I can still actually do stuff because the threads are different. And then it will take a few more seconds to load all the points because I think it was 200 some points that I was trying to plot in between. So depending on how much JavaScript that you have going on and how intricate it is, you might need to look at using workers. WebSockets allows two-way communication, where there's just an active connection where you don't have to pull a server, but there's just constantly open.
So right now we do some really dirty stuff in our application, like refreshing the page every 60 seconds just to see if there's any updates. If we were to implement these, we wouldn't have to do that. If the server were to get a new patient, you could just send it out to the client without us having to ask. That could really save on bandwidth too, because you don't have to send them the entire page. You can just send them the chunk you're looking for.
Notifications is actually something that only exists inside WebKit right now as well. It's supposed to be in one of the alpha builds of Firefox. I think it still hangs out there anyways. So user will be prompted for permissions just to allow notifications. And then after they've accepted that, you can start pushing notifications to them through the API. So then you'll actually get these little pop-ups, which comes in kind of neat if you have some kind of inbox feature inside your web application, and every single time that they get a message, you can actually just tell them, even when they're on a different URL, it will still pop up. File access. So there's the idea where you can actually start reading in meta attributes from files that have been dragged on, or from images that have been dragged on, or just a better way of dealing with files. You see this like in Gmail. If you ever want to drag an attachment in there, as soon as you drag it into your browser, you'll see an area where it says drop over here or something like that to attach it. When you do that, when they're looking at that, they're actually looking at the meta attributes to see where it's coming from, what kind of document it is. And you can also modify that too. So if you let a user move text around, as soon as they drop it, then you can modify it, add some extra classes to it, or whatever you need to do. We actually do this currently on patient registry for our form elements. That way when people drop them on as merge fields, and it actually creates the element in the background. So this would be closer to the example of what Gmail actually does. Is once you drag something on, you're actually reading in that entire array, the binary data, you're getting that, and then you're doing something with it. For them, they're actually reading into a temporary variable that exists on the page, and then just saying that it's being attached or being uploaded. For this one, I'm just re-rendering out the exact same information out to the page. And then with that, since you're just dealing with blobs anyways, I could make it that way. I drag out a MP3 and then I could play it. So that way you almost have like a two-way communication that you could, where a user could drag off a document, edit it, and then just drag it back on. There's the geolocation JavaScript API that came around, where you can actually ask the browser to get the current position of the computer. Usually they will use some kind of metrics where they ping, say, like bing.com or google.com, and they figure out based off of like the NS lookup which routers that you're hitting to say where your current location is. One thing that does happen is when you do that, then you also do get prompted to say whether or not you want to allow that site to use that information. It'd be the same thing with a lot of those APIs. This is one of those things that might be kind of useful, especially if you need to give directions to another particular address. You can find out their actual current position without them typing in their current address, and then just figuring out the directions from there. Device orientation. Depending on what kind of device that you have, this also works usually like on tablets, or I know the Chromebooks also give off this as well. My laptop does not, but I think I can fake it. Which would be similar to if I had my laptop rotated. Fashion. And with some of the browsers are implementing where they have some kind of speech capability where they can use it. Checking speech input. So that way a user might be able to, if they don't really know how to type what they're saying, they might know how to say it a little bit easier, especially if it's a person's name, or they just want to type or say what they're doing anyways. So we're all used to having, like, say, a div ID of header, a div ID of content, a div ID of footer. When they started working on the HTML5 spec, they also created better semantic tags, so that way you wouldn't necessarily just be creating a bunch of divs, you'd see useful block elements. And with that comes things such as header, nav, article, figure caption, and footer, and time. So that way when you're actually looking at it, say from, if you're trying to read an HTML document as an XML format, you'll actually see these elements as something a little bit more useful. So if you ever need to parse HTML as XML. Form elements started to actually get some more love. So you can have a data list, which would be similar to, say, like one of our autocompletes. They also made it so that way there's a meter, progress. If you give it a current value, which you would change with, say, JavaScript, as the user is uploading a file, or maybe they're doing some kind of power tool wizard thing. Could give them more of an indicator of how far they are throughout the entire steps. More descriptive link relations, which we don't necessarily use a whole lot of. The CMS side, they would use more of, just for better search engine optimization normally. One thing that you might note a little bit more would be the prefetch. There's also next and previous that come along with this, where the prefetch, when the browser is idle, it'll actually start downloading that page in the background, which could be useful if you are, say, like on the list page and they might press the next button to go to the next page. You might have it prefetch that content, so that way as soon as they click it, it's ready to go. It may not always make sense, but there might be times where it could be useful. Other microdata, if you view an HTML document as an XML, these would be other attributes that are on there. Normally, Google will already use this, so that way when they're showing the content from the search results, they might have little extra properties that show up below it. Usually, you'll see that when you're looking at a website that has like a rating system. You might see that I think it's Metacritic that actually does it, where it'll show that something got 3 out of 5 points. Area attributes, which are used for accessibility. So that way when a screen reader is going through your document, you will just give more meta attributes to say what navigational structure is actually important, what content is important, how the user should be seeing things, and when they can't actually see, I suppose, if they're blind and they're using the accessibility. Form types can actually mark something as required. There's the input of email as well, date, which will now give a calendar instead of having to actually roll one yourself. The browser can actually take care of it for you. So that way we wouldn't necessarily have to hold a calendar input anymore. There's a range. Placeholder, where it actually comes with text in the background already, but that's not actually part of the input, but disappears as soon as you type up. You can add a pattern, which is just a regular expression to say something is valid or not. Color picker of input type color. Number field, where you can actually have a stat min max. So we don't necessarily have to do validation to say that their sort order is actually a number. You can actually put in some values. These also come in really handy when you're dealing with touch devices. You will then get different keyboards based off of your input type. So it only shows context-aware information. So if you have a type of number, you're only going to get the number pad. If you have an email, it's only going to show you characters that are more related to an email address. Other things that is implemented would be audio and video. actually go down through WIDI. Okay. Fun stuff that you can do is you can also use any of the CSS properties with any of these. So that way you can actually add, like, say, CSS to a reflection to a video if you wanted to. Can also play MP3s or play sound. You can now draw shapes using Canvas, and if anybody's ever used like the Java Canvas library for drawing things in the past, it's the exact same ideas and implementation, and usually has better documentation than the HTML version for the actual documentation. But when you mix and match things, you also get where you can actually now export images if you want to, just because they are just a blob. And if you ever need to do any more data manipulation with them or save them off to the database after a user has modified them, they can. Canvas, using the WebGL libraries as well. The browser will try to use the graphics card for any of this offloading of the processing power whenever it's able to. This is where a lot of game development is being made right now. We're just using the whole WebGL parts. It's almost lunchtime. You can use that and then you'll feel better. Oh, okay. SVG, which is able to create vector-based images using just XML, where we actually are going to start doing some of this inside some of the newer products, I believe, for logos and icons. I believe Tim was going to start creating some SVG icons for Fieldbridge Express and for a few other projects, actually. So that way, as you make them bigger, smaller, it doesn't matter. They're always going to retain, sadness. Will always maintain their quality just because they're all math-based. New selectors that you can have, where you don't necessarily have to add a class of odd, even to a table row. You can just use the selector of odd or even to say every other one. You can actually use where you might have an attribute that has a particular value, and you just want to grab all the inputs, the divs of that type. So if I had a div with a class of something, I could also put that in here, and that way it would only pertain just to that one. You can now do negation, where you can say not of something, where you could put this entire thing in there if you want to, so that way you can filter down a little bit easier. Web fonts, for the people that want to use the non-standard fonts. We do this in all the newer projects that I've seen, at least, where they want to use, I think they usually use Droid Sans, actually, but where they will, where I'm declaring my actual font in here, but it doesn't exist on the user's computer, so then they would request it from the website. Ellipsis, so we don't always have to use truncate. So you can manage your content and the browser takes care of when to cut it off. Columns. So your content can adjust and you can still have a number of different content, which is more similar to what a newspaper kind of has. More text changes with CSS, opacity, with RGBA, there's also HSLA, just different formats. Same idea. Rounded corners, because a lot of people like rounded corners. Gradients that you can have linear, you can have radial. There's also a number of different ones as well. You can stack these so you can give some fun effects. Shadows, which you can have on text, you can have on divs or pretty much any type of element. Reflections you can add now. For backgrounds, also made it that way you can have a contain where as I make it bigger, it'll still maintain the same size. It'll still be stretched out. You can have multiple background images for one div now. And there's now border images. Box model, where, I don't know if I'll be able to show this really well. Nope. If you ever use the Minerva dashboard, the component that's built in, that actually uses the box, Flexbox stuff for growing and expanding the widgets as you may resize your browser window or that content area gets resized. You'll see some kind of small stretchiness up here. That's how everything tries to stay in that 3-column position. Same idea. Transitions now come with CSS. One thing to note is that these are going to be better than the JavaScript counterparts that people have used in the past because they're hardware accelerated. They're on a different thread as well. So you also get a smoother, you'll get a smoother transition because it's able to go between pixels into subpixels, something along those lines. As opposed to where if it was done with JavaScript, it would use the XY positioning to say where it should go. Translations to just make things rotate if you ever need to rotate some text. More animations. New selectors for when you're dealing with JavaScript and you need to, instead of just doing a get element by ID and then you're trying to transverse the DOM that way, there's now the query selector all, which uses just the exact same syntax of CSS to actually get an array of elements which return the same thing that jQuery would, but if you don't want to use jQuery or a different JavaScript library, it's built in to JavaScript now. Data attributes, where you can put these inside. It's another way of doing meta attributes on there instead of using, say, like a bunch of classes or a bunch of other attributes. These have more of an API, so that way you can actually get a struct back after you've selected out the main element. You can actually modify classes this way. Where you'll actually get a class list. You can add, remove, you can modify them. History API, if you ever need to try removing or something or modifying a user's history, you can do that now. So that way, if you want to make sure that they don't go back to, say, like some kind of form saving page, you'd be able to change the URL to make it go someplace else. Modern browsers pretty much support majority of these things. Mobile browsers do as well. If you have any questions, you can ask me, Justin, Google. For some of the backwards compatibility, you can use Chrome Frame, which is an option, which is pretty much a Chrome shell that gets embedded inside a user's browser, but then you're asking them to install a plugin. So that may not necessarily be an option, but it is for some sites. And there's plenty of examples. Thank you. Any other questions?